Greetings to all our viewers. Some geopolitical turning points don't begin with war. They begin with a quiet flight and a discreet handshake behind a tightly closed door. Today, as the Prime Minister of Canada sets foot in Beijing after 8 long years of silence, the world is witnessing a subtle yet deeply dangerous shift in the US-led global order. Why did Donald Trump, perhaps unintentionally, push a close ally like Canada into China's arms? And how might this visit reshape the balance of global power? If you want to understand the real movements behind those brief headlines, hit that subscribe button now, and let's begin the story. Not all geopolitical shifts are heralded by gunfire. They don't come stamped with military treaties or thunderous speeches. Often they arrive much more quietly. A long-haul flight across the Pacific, a carefully calculated handshake, and a door closing behind meetings where no cameras are allowed. On January 13th, when Mark Carney stepped onto Beijing soil, the moment passed without fanfare, but it carried the weight of a decade of pent-up tension. For 8 years, Canada and China had barely looked each other in the eye. 8 years of stifled trade, frozen dialogue, and a default setting of mutual distrust. In geopolitics, that isn't a neutral pause. It's a festering crack waiting for a shock strong enough to force a shift. Carney didn't come to Beijing looking for praise or photo ops. He came because Canada has been backed into a corner. For decades, Ottawa operated under the comfort of what felt like an eternal truth. The US market was always there, open, stable, and predictable. But Donald Trump shattered that illusion. Tariffs struck like sudden knives. Threats turned trade into political hostage-taking. Even allied sovereignty became something to bargain over. When trade becomes a weapon, dependence is no longer a strength, it's a fatal vulnerability. For a country that sends 3/4 of its exports to the US, every whim from Washington has the potential to spiral into a domestic crisis. Carney knows this all too well. He knows no nation is truly free if its entire economic fate lies in someone else's hands. In that context, China isn't an ideal partner in terms of trust or shared values. But geopolitics rarely runs on sentiment, it runs on survival. And when every other door is closed or starting to crack, the door to Beijing, cold and risky as it may be, becomes the one Canada is forced to knock on. But to understand why this seemingly solitary visit carries such heavy meaning, we need to rewind. We need to look back at the past 8 years. A stretch where Canada-China relations slid from cooperation to confrontation, from economic partners to quiet adversaries, where every decision left deep scars on both sides. The breakdown of Canada-China relations didn't come with a dramatic crash. It was more like a pane of glass cracking from the inside, starting with faint, almost invisible lines. But over time, each political touch caused the cracks to spread until the entire frame gave way. Before 2018, the relationship, if not exactly warm, was at least pragmatic and running smoothly. China was Canada's second-largest export market, absorbing massive quantities of canola, pork, seafood, lumber, and minerals. In Western Canadian provinces, China wasn't some distant geopolitical concept. It was a customer, a contract, a harvest season, a family's income. At the time, Ottawa believed it could stay tightly aligned with Washington while still maintaining a stable economic channel with Beijing. Then, in 2018, a single legal decision triggered a chain reaction that spiraled far beyond its initial calculations. Canada arrested a top Huawei executive at the request of a US extradition order. On paper, it was a matter of legal compliance and treaty obligations. But in Beijing's eyes, it was proof that Ottawa was willing to sacrifice bilateral interests in service of Washington's strategic priorities. China's response wasn't limited to diplomacy. It struck straight at Canada's most sensitive points. 2 Canadian citizens were arrested and held for years, becoming stark symbols of a cold standoff. Canola, a strategic export crop, was blocked at the ports. Pork and seafood were scrutinized, delayed, then hit with tariffs. Investment froze. High-level dialogue all but vanished from the calendar. The bilateral relationship slipped into what analysts dubbed an economic Cold War, with no bullets fired, but very real damage done. In Ottawa, there had once been a belief that time would smooth things over, but as months passed, tensions didn't ease, they calcified. The breaking point came when Canada, under strategic pressure from the US and Europe, imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. Politically, It was a statement of allegiance to the Western Industrial Front. Economically, it was a risky gamble. Beijing struck back almost instantly, and this time with no restraint. Punitive tariffs hit with devastating force. Canola, canola oil, meal, pork, seafood, the lifeblood of Canadian agriculture. The consequences didn't show up in diplomatic communiques. They showed up in the fields of Saskatchewan, in the processing plants of Manitoba, in the blood-red balance sheets of local businesses. In a short span, canola exports to China plummeted. Tens of thousands of farmers lost their market. A sense of abandonment began to spread. Canada then faced a bitter truth. Standing with Washington didn't mean being shielded from the fallout. The price of strategic alignment wasn't paid in government meeting rooms. It landed directly in the lives of everyday people. The Canada-China relationship wasn't just frozen, it had been scarred deeply, leaving a lingering distrust. And it was in this exact context that another variable entered the game, one that reshaped the entire equation. Not Beijing, not Ottawa, but Washington under Donald Trump. When Trump began using tariffs as his default tool, treating both allies and rivals as bargaining chips, Canada realized its problem wasn't just China anymore. A larger issue had emerged. When your biggest ally becomes a source of risk, no old strategy is safe. Donald Trump didn't just reshape America's relationship with its adversaries, he shook the very way its allies viewed the United States. In Trump's worldview, the globe wasn't divided into long-term friends and strategic foes, but into those who were winning and those who were taking advantage. And through that lens, Canada was no longer the reliable next-door neighbor, but an economy benefiting too much from America's leniency. At first, Trump's rhetoric sounded like political exaggeration, but it quickly turned into concrete action. Tariffs were imposed or threatened in the span of a single tweet. Agreements once considered untouchable were suddenly treated as bargaining chips. And the most dangerous part wasn't the percentage of the tariffs, it was the uncertainty. No one in Ottawa could be sure that Washington's decisions today would still hold tomorrow. For Canada, this was a strategic psychological shock. A country that had built its entire growth model on the stability of the U.S. market suddenly realized that foundation could be pulled out at any moment. When Trump spoke of sweeping tariffs, or even half-jokingly referred to Canada as the 51st state, the message was clear. The alliance no longer guaranteed protection. Mark Carney, with the background of a seasoned economist and former head of major central banks, saw this risk long before most politicians did. He understood that over-reliance on a single market wasn't just a trade issue, it was a national security issue. When 75% of exports go to the U.S., Canada has almost no room to negotiate. Every threat from Washington could quickly turn into domestic pressure, job losses, and political instability. But Trump didn't stop with Canada. His policies sent shockwaves across the globe. His decision to tighten and even cut off oil imports from Venezuela wasn't just a strike against Caracas. It disrupted the global energy supply chain. China, one of the largest consumers of Venezuela's heavy crude, found itself short of compatible supply for its refineries. And in that vacuum, Canada emerged as the natural alternative. After years of delays and fierce debate, the Trans Mountain Pipeline was finally completed, opening a direct route from Canada's oil fields to the Pacific. Crude that had long been landlocked began to flow toward Asia. China quickly became a key destination, not out of political goodwill, but out of practical necessity and technical compatibility. Canadian crude oil exports to China surged quietly but steadily. Chinese refineries began adjusting their operations to handle Canadian oil. And once those adjustments took place, the relationship was no longer easily reversible. In energy geopolitics, this is the most resilient form of connection, where infrastructure and sunk costs create mutual dependency. Paradoxically, Trump became the catalyst for this restructuring. By weaponizing trade, the U.S. forced Canada to learn the hard lesson of risk diversification, not to turn away from Washington, but to avoid being suffocated every time the political winds shifted. And once Ottawa realized it had new leverage, from energy to agriculture, the question was no longer whether to talk to Beijing. The question became how to talk and what to ask for in return. That was the moment when a grand negotiation began to take shape, where electric vehicles, canola, crude oil, and geopolitical influence were all laid out on the same table, in a game where no side could afford to move naively. The meeting in Beijing didn't unfold in a mood of enthusiasm or artificial optimism. It had the tone of a cold negotiation, one where both sides knew exactly what they needed and how far they were willing to go. There were no vague promises, no lofty declarations. On the table were numbers, tariffs, and bleeding sectors of the economy. China's offer was blunt to the point of being almost brutal. Canada lifts the 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, and in return, Beijing rolls back the punitive barriers that have been choking Canadian canola, pork, and seafood for years. For China, it's a gateway into a developed market with high purchasing power and a stable legal infrastructure. For Canada, it's a lifeline, a chance to rescue Western agriculture from a slow collapse under the weight of frustration and despair. Mark Carney understood this wasn't a pretty deal. It was a necessary one. In Ontario, the auto industry and labor unions view Chinese EVs with suspicion, even hostility. They fear a wave of cheap cars could destabilize the domestic supply chain. But in Saskatchewan and Alberta, farmers were out of patience. Symbolic solutions weren't enough anymore. For them, the Chinese market wasn't some abstract geopolitical idea. It was survival for the next harvest. So the bargaining wasn't just between Ottawa and Beijing. It was unfolding silently within Canada itself. Every decision came with political consequences. Every concession had a price. But Carney understood one truth. In a democracy, no foreign policy can last if it ignores the livelihoods of hundreds of thousands of citizens. Alongside agriculture, it was energy that drew Beijing's sharpest attention. Canadian crude, after clearing countless domestic hurdles to reach the Pacific, had found its place in Chinese refineries. This wasn't a short-term commercial arrangement. When a refinery adjusts its processes to handle a specific kind of crude, switching back isn't easy. The cost is high, the risk even higher. And that very difficulty of reversal makes energy trade a source of strategic influence. China knew this. Canada knew it too. Oil doesn't just bring revenue, it creates long-term entanglement. Every oil tanker that docks at a Chinese port isn't just a contract fulfilled. It's another thread woven into Beijing's resource security framework. For Canada, this was one of the rare times it held real leverage, not based on values or alliances, but on irreplaceable need. The negotiation then went far beyond EVs or canola. It reached into the heart of 21st century power. Whoever controls the steady flow of resources holds the voice. China is actively working to reduce its dependence on the Middle East and Africa, regions riddled with volatility. Canada, seen as a stable, resource-rich nation with minimal geopolitical risk, has become an attractive piece of the puzzle. But Carney wasn't naive. He understood that every concession made today sets expectations for tomorrow. China is not an easy partner, and trade can always be weaponized. That's why every discussion took place within a larger framework. Canada isn't looking to replace the US with China. Canada is looking for options. When the meetings ended, there were no grand announcements, but the signals were clear for those who knew how to read between the lines. Dialogue channels reopened, tariff figures were being crunched, and most importantly, Canada realized it no longer stood before a single door. From this negotiation, a new mindset began to take shape in Ottawa. If Canada could bargain firmly with Beijing without being strangled by Washington, then the question was no longer about choosing sides. The question became how to build a strategy where no one can force your hand. And that was the moment when the concept of strategic autonomy moved beyond theory, becoming a guiding principle for a Canada trying to step out from the familiar but increasingly dangerous shadow of the United States. The strategy Mark Carney is pursuing isn't spelled out in grand slogans, but it follows a cold, consistent logic. Canada isn't seeking to break away from the United States in the sense of rupture or confrontation. What Carney wants is to escape a state of absolute dependency, where every decision made in Washington can instantly trigger a shockwave through Canada's economy. In his view, autonomy doesn't mean standing alone. It means having enough options not to be cornered. For decades, the shadow of the U.S. has been both a shelter and a limit for Canada. Stable cross-border trade, tightly integrated supply chains, and geographic proximity created a sense of safety so strong that many forgot a fundamental rule of power. any absolute dependency can be exploited. When Trump turned tariffs into political weapons, that shadow suddenly grew heavy, even threatening. Carney saw another path. If Canada could broaden its network of partners, if exports outside the US reached a meaningful scale, then every threat from Washington would lose some of its weight. The US would remain the most important partner, but no longer the sole pillar. Strategic autonomy, in this sense, is the art of balancing great powers, ensuring no one holds life and death control over the nation's economic fate. That's why Beijing is just one piece in a much larger puzzle. Alongside China, Canada has accelerated its outreach to Europe, strengthened trade agreements, and pushed open new doors in India and Southeast Asia. The goal isn't to replace the American market overnight, but to gradually restructure trade flows. From an economy where 3/4 of exports depend on a single country, Canada is aiming to become one with multiple pillars, where risk is spread across geopolitical space. Infrastructure has become the backbone of this strategy. Trans Mountain is not just a pipeline. It's a symbol of a mental shift. When oil and resources can move directly to the Pacific, Canada is no longer locked into the North American continent. Ports, logistics routes, trade finance, and risk insurance are being redesigned for a multipolar world, not just one dominant market. And once infrastructure exists, it creates momentum. Businesses reconfigure supply chains. Banks design financial products accordingly. Local governments reshape development strategies. Strategic autonomy, then, is no longer just a political will. It becomes a hardwired structure within the economy. But Carney also knows this path won't be smooth. Stepping out from under America's shadow means stepping into a harsher light, where Canada must own every choice it makes. Diversification brings leverage, but also complexity. Unpredictable partners, hard-to-avoid risks, and relationships that defy simple alignment. As Canada opens its doors to China, the question is no longer whether the strategy of autonomy is right. The question is, how much is Canada willing to pay for the right to choose? Because in geopolitics, every decision has a cost, and every step forward leaves behind potential fault lines. And from this moment on, a new chapter begins to emerge. One about risk, about the price that must inevitably be paid when a nation decides to step out of its familiar comfort zone in pursuit of true independence. There is no path to autonomy that comes with absolute safety. As Canada steps out from under the familiar umbrella of the United States, what it gains is not just broader strategic space, but also direct headwinds. Risk doesn't arrive as a single event, but accumulates gradually, seeping into every decision and every newly forged relationship. China, while attractive in scale and demand, has never been an easy partner to read. Trade with Beijing always carries unspoken conditions. Economic benefits can be granted swiftly, but just as swiftly withdrawn without warning if the political climate shifts. Canada has lived through that before during the freeze years, and the memory is still fresh. Every door that opens today comes with the question, could it slam shut just as suddenly? At home, this strategic shift isn't universally welcomed either. Industry, labor unions, national security circles, and public opinion remain divided on China. For some, easing restrictions on Beijing is seen as trading values for short-term gains. For others, it's the only practical choice to protect livelihoods. This tension isn't loud, but it simmers, and it could erupt quickly if the economy hits another shock. There's also the risk of slipping into a different kind of dependency, a more subtle one. As refineries, agricultural supply chains, and logistics networks begin to pivot toward Asia, Canada faces a familiar dilemma in a new form. If one market becomes too important, it gains leverage. Strategic autonomy cannot allow for absolute dependence, no matter who's on the other end. Geopolitically, the cost also shows up in Canada's relationship with Washington. The US may tolerate Canadian diversification, but only to a point. Every step closer to China is closely watched. Behind the scenes, pressure, colder diplomatic signals, or even soft trade retaliation are all scenarios that can't be ruled out. Stepping out of America's shadow doesn't mean that shadow disappears overnight. And then there's the hardest, most intangible risk, strategic fatigue. Maintaining balance among global powers demands constant vigilance, flexible recalibration, and a state apparatus strong enough to avoid missteps. A single miscalculated move could cost Canada both its leverage and its credibility. But perhaps the greatest cost doesn't lie out there. It lies within the choice to grow up. Once no longer sheltered under the absolute protection of another, Canada must accept a sobering truth. Autonomy means full responsibility. There is no one left to blame when things go wrong. And in the harsh world of geopolitics, that's both a burden and a sign that a nation is finally ready to step fully into its own role. Mark Carney's trip to Beijing ended without dramatic headlines or declarations loud enough to rattle markets overnight. But it's precisely that quiet that made it so significant. In the world of geopolitics, loud proclamations are often fleeting. It's the silent shifts that shape the future. Canada didn't step up to a microphone to announce its independence, but through action, it began to behave like a country determined to chart its own course. This wasn't a moment of turning away from the United States, nor was it a pivot toward China. It was something far more subtle, a signal that Canada no longer accepts the role of a dependent link, no longer willing to let its entire economic fate hang on the swings of Washington's political cycle. In a world that's increasingly unpredictable, absolute dependency is no longer a sign of security. It's an open invitation to risk. Carney, with the calm demeanor of an economist, understands that power in the 21st century doesn't come just from armies or moral slogans. It comes from the ability to choose. When a nation has multiple doors it can walk through, no one can lock them all at once. And with choices, threats begin to lose their weight. That's the essence of the silent declaration of independence Canada is now sending out. China in this story isn't the destination, it's the test. If Canada can trade with Beijing without losing control, if it can open its economy while keeping its strategic guard up, then it proves it is no satellite of any great power. The US may disapprove, China may calculate. But when Canada stands in a position of initiative, both are forced to adjust their approach. The road ahead won't be smooth. Ottawa will face moments of strain, caught between competing pressures, between economic interests and political values, between short-term safety and long-term autonomy. But it's these hard choices that distinguish a mature nation from one that simply leans on others. Canada's pivot is not just Canada's story. It's a mirror for many small and medium-sized nations navigating a world where great powers are becoming increasingly erratic. As the old order trembles, survival no longer lies in picking sides, but in having the resolve not to be pushed around by any of them. What do you think of Canada's choice? Is this a smart step towards safeguarding the future, or a high-stakes gamble in a power game between giants? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, because every perspective helps sharpen the bigger picture. And if you found this kind of deep analysis valuable, don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the geopolitical shifts quietly reshaping the world around us.